Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. We appreciate you being with us. We're going to give folks just a bit of time to get into the Zoom room this morning, but in the meantime, we'd like to invite you to use the chat box to check in. Please put in your name, your pronouns, and where you're joining us from using the chat, and we can all get to know each other in our Zoom webinar world. So we'll start in about 10, 15 seconds. Awesome. I see people filtering in. Cool. And for those of you just coming in, use that chat box. We've got it open for everyone. So you can chat in who you are, your preferred pronouns, and where you're joining us from today. All right. I see people already doing it. Awesome. Cool. Welcome, Stephanie. Welcome, Sarah. With that, I think just in the interest of time and as people filter in, I'm just going to get us started. So thank you, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us for our webinar today. We're going to dig into what Minnesota Power's long-range plan means for equity and public health. My name is Jo Olson. I'm the Senior Director of Communications and Engagement at Fresh Energy, and I will be your moderator today. Fresh Energy is a clean energy policy nonprofit in Minnesota that for 3 decades has helped Minnesota and the Midwest and everyone who live here end dependence on fossil fuel, electrify their lives, and build a healthy, clean energy economy where all can thrive. I'm so grateful to have so many people joining us today. And on behalf of Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, Minnesota Interfaith Power Light, PSE Healthy Energy, Sierra Club, Union of Concerned Scientists, and Fresh Energy, welcome to our co-hosted webinar. And as you can see, we have a lot to talk about today. We'll be taking a deep dive into the recent study from PSE Healthy Energy. And that study was filed in conjunction with the Clean Energy Organization's comments on Minnesota Power's Integrated Resource Plan, or IRP. And that was done at the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission. So we'll be talking about that study. It will be followed by a roundtable discussion with all of our guest experts. And then we'll wrap up with about 15 minutes or so dedicated to a live Q&A. I know some of you submitted questions when you registered, so those are on the list too. And now some housekeeping about submitting those questions. Even though the Q&A is happening at the end of the webinar, you can submit your questions at any time. We'll be using Zoom's Q&A function. It's like a button at the bottom of your screen. So if you click on that, a Q&A box will pop up, type in your questions. And if you like other people's questions, there's even a function to upvote the ones you like. So give those a thumbs up and they'll tick up the list for us when we get to the Q&A. And I think you were probably notified when you joined the room, but this webinar is being recorded. We'll email you a link to the recording later this afternoon or early tomorrow. And so now, next slide, on to the main event. Welcome to our presenters and panelists. I'm joined today by Kelsey Bilsbeck, Senior Scientist at PSE Healthy Energy, Barbara Fries, Climate Attorney with MCEA, James Geniak, Senior Midwest Energy Analyst at UCS, Brett Pence, Northern Minnesota Director at MNIPL, Isabel Ricker, my colleague and Director of Clean Electricity at Fresh Energy, and Jenny Yackel, an organizer with Sierra Club. So now I want to take a step back before we dive in and note here that in our planning discussions for this webinar, this whole group really wanted to emphasize that climate, energy, and environmental justice advocates have been asking for this kind of research for a really long time. So there are just a lot of organizations and advocates who've been pushing and working tirelessly to tell this side of the story. So this study and our conversation today is really building on the advocacy of many others over the years. So calling that out right now before we dive in. And I'm going to turn over the webinar controls to Kelsey, who's going to give us a 15-minute deep dive on the report on behalf of PSE Healthy Energy. Kelsey, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and you can take it away.
Awesome. All right. Can everyone see my screen in full
Yes.
screen mode? Okay, great.
Yep, looks great.
So I just want to thank you all for giving me this opportunity to speak with you today about our work on incorporating health and equity metrics into integrated resources planning. And so as Joe mentioned, I'm Kelsey Bilsbeck. I'm a senior scientist at PSE Healthy Energy. We are a nonprofit research institute focused on bringing scientists to energy use and planning. And this, the report that I'll be presenting today was done with myself in conjunction with my colleagues at PSE, and I specifically want to call out Elena, who did a lot of the front end work on reaching out with communities, as well as led the overall report. So integrated resources planning, or IRPs, are required in many states to ensure that utilities are adequately prepared for future energy needs. And so they're used for long-term planning, basically to decide how power plants are built, closed, or changed, and where that power is coming from. Is it coming from coal, natural gas, wind, or solar? And so the choices made through the IRP process will inevitably impact health, the environment, and the well-being of communities. So it's really important to include these dimensions when IRPs are being designed. So in my presentation today, I'm going to start by giving a high-level overview of our findings, and then I'll do a deep dive into the details of how we got there. So our report covered 4 key topic areas. Using equity and demographic metrics, we found that Minnesota's power plants tend to be located in socioeconomically disadvantaged communities. We also found that the coal and biomass plants in the portfolio had substantial health impacts, but that if these plants are retired ahead of schedule, this will reduce health costs, waste, and water use substantially. Further, we found that renters, low-income residents, and Black communities are especially burdened by energy costs, and that increasing spending on efficiency, weatherization, and solar programs that target these communities will help address these problems. So just to give a brief overview of Minnesota Power's plants, there are several main fossil fuel plants. These include Boswell. There are 2 units with Boswell, as well as Milton Young, which is located in North Dakota, which Minnesota Power purchases energy from. Then we have Hibbard, which uses wood, paper waste, and coal to generate electricity. And then we have Laskin, which is a peaker natural gas power plant, as well as the Namaji Trail Energy Center, which is a proposed natural gas plant in the proposal, but has not yet been built. So first we looked at the demographics of the populations living closest to the plants. And so this is important because the highest impacts per person tend to be for people living nearby and downwind of the plants. And so this graph here shows a analysis of the population living within a 1-mile radius of each of the existing plants. And so the color of these circles show a demographic indicator, which includes the 6 indicators I've listed here over on the right-hand side of the slide. And so the green colors show that there's a lower demographic index, which means that these populations tend to have lower cumulative socioeconomic burdens, and the orange to red colors indicate higher cumulative socioeconomic burdens. And then the color of the dots indicates the number of people living within that 1-mile radius. So what you can see here is that Hibbard, Boswell, and Namaji are located largely in low-income communities. And then Hibbard and Boswell tend to have high demographic indices. In addition, we see that Hibbard and Namaji have the highest nearby populations. And it's important to note that Namaji and Hibbard are actually located, the proposed plant is located within 6 miles of Hibbard. So this could potentially contribute to a higher cumulative economic burden for these residents. So overall, transitioning to lower or zero emissions energy like wind or solar could potentially greatly benefit communities living near these plants. Next, we modeled the health impacts of the plants themselves. And so first we did this by compiling emissions data from a variety of environmental agencies. And this included pollutants like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxides, and primary PM 2.5 or particulate matter that's emitted directly from the stack of the power plants. Then we took these emissions data and put them into reduced form atmospheric models, which capture how those pollutants evolve in time and space. And so it captures both the chemistry of the pollutants that eventually will form particulate matter and the transport. And that tells us who these emissions are impacting downwind from the source. And then the third step was using the results from these atmospheric models to look at how changes in health impacts, changes in emissions from the plants would result in particular health impacts. And this last point, number 3, relies on information from the peer-reviewed literature that takes epidemiological evidence to relate changes in particulate matter to specific health impacts like mortality. So for our health impact analysis, we looked at 2 primary metrics. The first was total health impacts. And so this here is showing an example for the Boswell coal plant for the emissions in 2021. And so the total health impacts tend to be the highest where you have the most population. So impacts will be higher if a power plant is located in an urban area, for example. We also looked at the per capita health impacts. And so those tend to be the highest downwind and from the plants and close by. And so those are sort of independent of the population located near the plant. So jumping into some results here, this figure is showing the total health impacts of the coal and biomass plants. So here we're looking at Boswell, Milton Young, and Hibbard. And so the first line here is showing the energy production from each of the plants. Then we show the mortalities and total health costs from the year 2001. And then we show the mortalities and total health costs projected over the course of the IRP. And this follows the mid-carbon regulation scenario proposed in the IRP. And so overall, we see that these coal plants have significant impacts on human health. And conversely, if the coal plants were retired about 5 years earlier, this would save about 20 lives per year and reduce adverse health impacts by up to $200 million. We also see that Hibbard is associated with relatively large impacts, and that's due to its urban location. The future impacts of Hibbard are uncertain because the operation of the paper mill that it is attached to has been changing, but we note that these impacts will be substantial as long as the plant is being operated as it was in 2021. Next, we looked into how these impacts were distributed. So this is showing the per capita health impacts of the coal and biomass plants by race and ethnicity. And these values are presented in terms of dollars per 100 people. And so what you can see here is that the health impacts tend to be higher for native populations, up to 2 to 3 times higher compared to the overall population. And so retiring these coal plants, as well as discontinuing the use of Hibbard, would help offset some of these disproportionate impacts. In addition to the coal and biomass plants, we looked at the emissions and health impacts from the Alaskan peaker power plant. Generally, we found that the emissions and impacts were smaller for Alaskan compared to the coal and biomass plants. However, we note that the emissions from these gas plants only constitute a small piece of the health and climate impacts because, for example, the oil and gas supply chain is known to leak through gas production, processing, and transmission. And so by only looking at the emissions from the power plant itself, we're only capturing a small picture of the overall climate and health impacts of gas plants. And this is also an important consideration for the proposed NTEC facility as well. In addition to looking at air pollution, we also looked at some of the other health and environmental risk factors. For example, coal waste is typically disposed of on site, which can lead to groundwater contamination. Additionally, thermal generating stations that are used by power plants have heavy water usage and can potentially return degraded water to water sources. And so in our report, we compiled a range of environmental data to assess hazards to health and the environment, and I've listed a few of these here on the slide. Overall, we found that retiring the Boswell coal plant early could reduce disposal of on-site waste by up to 2,000 tons and save approximately 2.6 gallons of water.
Oh.
Finally, we looked at energy cost burden of residents within Minnesota Power's territory. And so you can think of energy cost burden as the percent of household income that is spent on energy. And so this map shows the energy costs of households living within specific census tracts, with the blue colors showing lower energy cost burden and the red to orange colors showing higher energy cost burdens. And it's important to note that these results actually represent an average of each of the census tracts. So an individual household could be paying much higher rates than the census tract average. In addition to looking at energy costs themselves, we also looked at how these energy burdens were distributed across a range of demographic indicators. So here in this figure, we're showing an example for household income. And so on the x-axis here, we have the median household income, and on the y-axis, we have the energy burden. And what you can see here is that lower income households tend to spend more money on their energy bills than high income households, or a larger percent of their income. And this was important because we found that 30% of the customers in Minnesota Power's territory were considered low income. However, only about 20% of the funding and 11% of the efficiency savings were actually being seen by these households, meaning that the households that could potentially benefit the most from energy cost savings aren't the ones that are actually seeing them. So to address this, it would be possible to increase spending on efficiency and weatherization plans, so that these, and also add some provisions that these benefits must be realized by low income communities. Another possible way to address this would be by investing in low income solar programs to help energy savings reach these households. So overall, we found that Minnesota Power's plants tended to be located in disadvantaged communities. And this could potentially be addressed by accelerating transitions to zero or cleaner energy options. We also found that while the impacts of coal and biomass plants in the portfolio were substantial, potentially retiring the Boswell coal unit early could reduce adverse health costs by up to $200 million. And this would benefit Native communities who tend to face 2 to 3 times higher impacts compared to the overall population. Finally, we found that low-income communities, renters, and Black communities had disproportionately high energy cost burdens. And so future updates could include targeting efficiency and weatherization programs that focus on these communities, in addition to residential solar programs, could help combat some of these issues. And with that, I just want to thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions in the Q&A or in the chat.
Thank you so much, Kelsey. Really appreciate it. So I know folks probably have a lot of questions about the research. So I just want to remind people to use the Q&A chat box to put those questions in, and we will be sure to get to as many as we can at the end. So that means that we are on to the next phase of our webinar, which is the roundtable. So welcome Barbara, Jenna, Brett, Isabel, and James. Thank you for being here. All right, so I'm just going to dive right in if folks are ready. So this is the first time this kind of research has been done for a utility resource planning process here in Minnesota. It was important for the researchers at PSE Healthy Energy to get to know folks from communities that were impacted by the outcomes of the report. So Jenna and Brett, you both live in the Duluth area. How did you go about making sure that those connections happened via your roles at Sierra Club and MNIPL? So I know a lot of individuals and groups were involved in helping PSE get the lay of the land. Is there anyone specifically that you want to mention and thank as we get started with this discussion?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I can go first, and then I'll let my colleague Jenna speak. Yeah. How would we get involved? This is really a two-phase process in terms of information collection and in community engagement. So the first phase was really Elena Krieger, who's already been referred to from PSE, really trying to collect data. So she's trying to figure out what's going on in these communities. And in that case, both Jenna and I work in community organizing in Duluth and in Northeastern Minnesota in general. And so what we're trying to do is connect them to communities that might be around these coal plants, particularly communities that might be severely impacted. So that was the first phase. The second phase is really getting the draft of this report out, even broadening that out, and then using our contacts to do that. There's a ton of people to thank for that, and I think I'll let Jenna do that. I think I'll just end by saying that it's really critical to have a report like this to try and connect what's locals, people that know what's happening in their community, with researchers, and then with people that can translate that into a document that can be, used in a formal commission hearing like this. So yeah, I think this is really great. I'll let Jenna speak for the rest of it. Thanks, Jenna.
Thanks, Brett, and thanks, Joe, for the question. I just want to zoom out for a second to ground us in just like the significance of this report, which makes visible to the commission, but also just to community members how our energy systems affects people's lives. And in my role as an organizer in Northeast Minnesota, as Brett's role as well, we exist in part to connect people, individuals, community groups, organizations to decision-making spaces that shape our energy landscape, like our utilities regulatory body, the Public Utilities Commission. And the PUC's mission is to make decisions that are consistent with the public interest. So we think the public should be at the center of integrated resource plan decisions. And this report helps lay the groundwork for what part of centering community impacts can look like. And I do want to give a shout out to community leaders who helped shape the report through conversation, through questions, and that feedback process that Brett was mentioning from beginning to end. We spoke with representatives from the Leech Lake and Fond du Lac reservations, organizational leaders from places here in Duluth, like ACO, the American Indian Community Housing Organization, Honor the Earth, the Health Committee with Duluth NAACP, Equilibrium. I think some folks from ECO3 are here today, and folks too from the Nurses Union leadership to a volunteer-led group called the Itasca Clean Energy Team. And again, this was an iterative process of consultation between researchers and community, and hopefully at the end result provides community leaders in Minnesota Power's service territory with a framework and data that is helpful for their work in advocating for the health of those that they serve or represent. And I'll turn it back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Jenna, and thank you, Brett. So I think what we learned from Kelsey's portion of the presentation is that this study revealed a lot about the serious health implications of the emissions from Minnesota Power's coal and biomass plants. So Isabel, looking ahead to other utility resource planning processes. Now, I know that Otter Tail Powers will be happening this year too, a little later, but do you think that this type of analysis should become a standard part of long-range energy planning in Minnesota? And if so, why?
Yeah, thank you, Joe, and thank you everyone for being with us today. Nice to see so many great names in the chat. Yeah, so one of the requests that we are making of the Commission is to make this sort of public health analysis a standard part of resource plans going forward. We are planning to do a similar analysis for Otter Tail's resource plan, given that it's likely to happen before the Commission may make that decision. But I think we really see this as a critical component of a broader movement to integrate a variety of equity concerns better into our energy planning. A number of groups, too many to name, have been doing a great job at emphasizing that to state regulators in a variety of proceedings at the Commission and elsewhere, and elevating for all of us the importance of considering equity and a range of human impacts of our decisions and our infrastructure. And public health is one element of that. And we think it's a really important element to be integrating into resource plans because there are significant, tangible, and quantifiable human impacts from how we're spending money. And there's a lot of dollars on the line. And as we see from this report as well, a number of lives potentially as well. And it's well within the Commission's purview to consider socioeconomic impacts. They are already required to do so, but we don't have a very robust method for that so far. So one of our main objectives with putting this report together was to demonstrate one example of how to do that and provide some concrete numbers for the Commission to consider. So we're hoping that will be helpful and that similar analysis can become sort of a standard thing going forward. And one of the things that we think it provides that is not yet considered in, because the Commission does require utilities to quantify environmental costs, but those are exclusively monetary values. And we do think it's important to also have the human health numbers and quantify that human impact as well.
Thank you, Isabel. I know both you and Barbara are working with the Public Utilities Commission a lot. And Barbara, did you have any thoughts there that you wanted to add? I know we're going to get to some questions geared toward you later on.
Sure, thanks, Joe. I would just quickly echo the importance of translating these sort of abstract behind the scenes statistics, particularly the ones that have been turned into dollar signs, and bringing them back into human impact. And I think, as Jenna was saying, making that visible both to the communities involved, especially the local communities where most of these impacts fall, and to the public utility commissioners.
Well put. Thank you, Barbara. So at this point, we've been talking a lot about the area around Minnesota Power's coal and biomass plants, as well as the proposed NTEC site. But let's zoom out beyond Minnesota and look at the region. So James, Union of Concerned Scientists has been involved in studies like this in other areas of the Midwest too, I think including Michigan. So what can you tell us about the important learnings in Michigan and any health-related themes you're seeing across states, utilities, and more? How has bringing the impacts on people's lives into the discussion changed the conversation?
Sure. Thank you, Joe. Thank you for having me on the panel today. Yeah, I would like to talk about the example from Michigan and how these types of analyses are gaining traction. So similar to Minnesota, public health and environmental justice advocates have been asking for consideration of environmental health and equity impacts in Michigan resource plans for many years. And building on that Advocacy, this time around a coalition of groups, including Union of Concerned Scientists, were also able to work with Kelsey and her team at PSE Healthy Energy to submit a similar analysis of health and equity metrics in an IRP docket for Consumers Energy, one of the two large utilities in Michigan. So the IRPs there are contested cases. So PSE's work took the form of testimony, expert testimony in the case, and it really helped us support the utilities plans for earlier coal plant retirements. And it also bolstered opposition to the acquisition of a particularly problematic industrial gas plant located in an area with high cumulative impacts and socioeconomic burdens. And the testimony led to the administrative law judge in her proposed decision in the case, referencing the testimony as important information for the Michigan Commission to consider. So that gives us a valuable type of legal precedent that we can cite to moving forward. And we were also able to use Kelsey and PSE's important work in settlement negotiations with Consumers Energy. And so able to get many of PSE's recommended analyses into that agreement as commitments for the company to do in future IRPs. So that settlement agreement is pending in Michigan. We're hopeful the commission there will approve it, and that will become another precedent for us to show the growing consensus on including health and equity metrics in state resource planning. I also think the Michigan example shows how collaborative and compelling efforts like what was done here for Minnesota Power, and then taking the step of getting those analyses into the record and into the case discussion can build a foundation for greater consideration of health and equity in utility planning, because ultimately we want to get to a place where the utilities are doing these analyses and where state regulators are expecting and requiring the analyses, and so that this information becomes a regular part of resource planning for utility stakeholders and the public to evaluate.
Thanks, James. So, of course, there are some really significant equity and environmental justice implications that are laid bare in this report specifically. Jenna, can you talk about some of the equity implications, especially of the study's findings around health outcomes tied to the Hibbard plant, which, side note, you live right next to, right?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. I'll first try to paint a picture of where the Hibbard plant is located in Duluth. It's located in West Duluth along the riverfront or the waterfront of St. Louis Bay, where Lake Superior meets the St. Louis River. And this is a really industrial part of town. The facility is attached to the Verso paper mill using paper pulp waste for burning that biomass. We're in the Twin Ports, so we have shipping docks. There are a number of trucking facilities across this part of town, and I-35 cuts through West Duluth as well as kind of a tangled web of highways. It's pretty concentrated here, that type of infrastructure, and the Hibbard plant is also downwind, or the Fond du Lac Reservation is downwind of this area, and this area is also, in addition to industry, is densely populated. It's a densely populated residential space, and I'm one of those people. More than 3,000 folks live within a 1 mile radius of the Hibbard plant, and 30,000 folks live within 3 miles of the Hibbard plant. And I'll just share maybe a little bit about the demographics of the folks who live here. These Western neighborhoods in Duluth, specifically West Duluth neighborhoods, Lincoln Park and the Central Hillside, collectively have the lowest median household incomes across our city. And there are more people living in poverty on this side of town than on the eastern side of town. And Western neighborhoods in Duluth are also the most racially diverse. And life expectancy in the Western neighborhoods here is about 10 or 11 years less than residents who live on the eastern side of the city. And these are geographic communities where the upper end of life expectancy range is actually less than the lowest life expectancy average across the city. And this kind of information you can find in the community needs assessment done by our health providers and the St. Louis County Public Health Department here. And if I have time, Joe, I'd like to emphasize just a little bit more about how Hibbard affects our home and community members. Minnesota Power's proposed IRP does continue to use electricity from Hibbard, and PSE Healthy Energy modeled that Minnesota Power's proposed plan would cause an estimated almost 40 premature deaths and a total of over $400 million in health costs. And just in 2021, this last year, there were about six unnecessary mortalities and about $70 million in health impacts associated with Hibbard. So this is a place where low income communities, Native communities, communities of color reside. The ongoing use of Hibbard, as Minnesota Power proposes to do, means ongoing air pollution in this community, disproportionately affecting folks that live here. I live here within a 1 mile radius of Hibbard. I have asthma, and on poor air quality days due to wildfire smoke just north of us, we run an air filter on our home. So when we say that our energy providers, our utilities, are perpetuators of environmental injustice, this is what we mean, is that there's a power imbalance between those who benefit, shareholders, from the energy system that we have, and those who bear the burden of air pollution, paying more for utility bills, and folks who are vulnerable to climate change and who are not the cause of it. So I'm grateful that the clean energy organization's proposed plan to the PUC urges the commission to order an immediate retirement of the facility. And I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Jenna. And Brett, I'm just turning to you now. Can you discuss what this report means for some of the environmental justice work underway in the area?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. And I think Jenna just gave an excellent definition of environmental justice. I don't think I could do better than to the last part of her discussion. But the reality is these kinds of concepts are, they're nebulous. You know, the language can be used and turned really by anyone. Another related concept is called just transition. That is a concept that's thrown around up here a lot. And that is more about what happens to a community like Cohasset, where Boswell Energy Center is located. What's going to happen to that community when a coal plant shuts down? What happens to the workers, to the folks that rely on the income from that? That's an important thing to talk about as well. But the interesting thing is those are concepts that are often separated. And as this report shows, they're often the same population. So a community like Cohasset or West Duluth, they're often told the benefits of a place, but not given the metrics of the full costs, in the human cost and the community cost of having these plants there. So this, kind of evens that field a little bit. It levels the playing field. The other thing that we see is that if we don't define what justice means, whatever we want to call it, if we don't define that, if we don't provide metrics of it, we can't reach it. And I want to note that within Minnesota Power's IRP, Minnesota Power uses the term just transition about 6 times. And their version of how they define it is a coal plant should be left open longer, because otherwise the community would be impacted more greatly, like Cohasset. But of course, they don't recognize these costs. So when we bring these costs into the report, it makes it real in terms of exactly what those costs are. And then these communities that are impacted can really do a better job of evaluating what the real value of a plant is, both the costs and the benefits. So I think it's really essential to the work that's happening here.
Thanks, Brett. So one of the key features of the comments that were filed at the Public Utilities Commission by the clean energy organizations was the Namaji Trail Energy Center, commonly known as NTEC. There's a lot about NTEC in the overall comments, but also the health report brought even more importance to those comments by highlighting the major life cycle greenhouse gas impacts of a new gas plant like NTEC. Barbara, you've been working on NTEC for years at this point. Can you talk about some of the true climate impacts that were revealed?
Sure. Thank you, Joe. And actually, what I'd like to do is start with just a little bit of background on how we have looked at gas plants in the context of climate protection. For many years, it was argued, and I think widely thought, that gas plants would be a really helpful step in the right direction when it came to reducing our climate pollution. And that was based on looking just at the carbon dioxide emissions from a new gas plant as compared to a coal plant. And so for a utility or a state trying to shift away from coal, gas was seen as this sort of bridge fuel. A couple things have happened in the years since. One, we have learned we have a whole lot less time than we thought to be reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We don't have decades to reduce it by 80%. We probably have something more like from now until 2035 to reduce it 100%, at least from the power sector. Also, we have learned that natural gas plants are much more harmful to the climate than we thought because, as Joe mentioned, if you look at the upstream emissions from methane, natural gas is mostly methane. Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, and particularly if you're focusing on the next couple of decades as opposed to on the whole next century, methane is something like 83 times as potent as carbon dioxide. And so if just a little bit of this stuff leaks out along the way from production to use, you have really got a big climate problem, and you have really undermined anything you might have thought was the climate benefit of shifting away from coal towards natural gas. In addition, there are nitrous oxide emissions from natural gas plants that tend not to get much attention. Nitrous oxide, another greenhouse gas that we've tended to overlook. So what Kelsey and her team did for us was to really look at the math associated with NTEC, look at the climate impact of the upstream emissions, also look at the nitrous oxide emissions from NTEC. And they recognized then and documented that the impact to the climate would be more than double what would have been thought if you were just looking at the CO2 emissions from the plant. So, and I should say that's if you look at it over a 20-year period as opposed to looking out over, say, a whole century. So, by the way, I should say that right now the climate science and these series now of national modeling studies are telling us that the power sector needs to aim for zero carbon emissions by 2035 if we're going to keep warming to the level that the world has now committed to aiming for, which is the 1.5 degree limit. And indeed, the Biden administration has announced that that is their goal. That's what they're going to be aiming for in the policies they put forth. So if NTEC were to come online in 2027, which is its current estimated operation date, well, 2035 is only 8 years later. They would have to close down if we're going to try to stay on track, or they would have to somehow transform themselves into something else, which would be very costly and maybe not possible. Certainly, we could not see this plant operating for its estimated lifetime, which I think is now estimated at something like 40 years, and be on track to make the climate reductions we need. So that's what I think makes this report very useful, to give us the numbers to really focus on that particular problem and to illustrate the incompatibility of NTEC with our climate reduction plans.
Thank you, Barbara. So in addition to the the public health and life cycle greenhouse gas impacts, the health report also delved into another key equity component, and that was reducing the energy burden and improving the equity of clean energy access. So what do the findings mean for Minnesota Power's current investments in things like their energy efficiency and solar projects? Isabel, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. So as Kelsey mentioned, PSE looked at essentially, do the investments we're making in programs that have benefits for reducing energy burden, specifically energy efficiency programming through the Conservation Improvement Program here in Minnesota, or solar programs, do those investments and the savings achieved by them keep up with, or are they proportional to the need among Minnesota Power's customers? And they found about 30% of Minnesota Power's residential customers qualify as low income. Fresh Energy likes to use the term under-resourced communities, so I'll use that. But the spending and savings aren't quite at that level. Spending has been around 20% and savings around 11%. So we are recommending that Minnesota Power work toward essentially tripling that savings achieved by low income or under-resourced communities through their SIP programs. I should say, though, the state has passed a law last year called the Energy Conservation and Optimization Act, or ECO Act of 2021, which does require utilities to double and then triple spending on their low-income SIP programs. And Minnesota Power's already filed plan does meet those enhanced requirements. I believe they're the only utility whose plan already meets the requirements, so they're a bit ahead of schedule there, but there is still a gap between, minimum state law and keeping up with the actual need of their customer base. So we and others on this call are committed to continuing to advocate for expanding those programs and trying to ensure that we're spending money very, as effectively as we can, and ensuring that we're overcoming barriers to conservation that, under-resourced communities face additional barriers. So one of the things we're working on is pre-weatherization. So getting over some of those initial hurdles that will allow us to make weatherization improvements. And similarly with the solar programming, we had less specific recommendations on that, but in general, they need more funding.
Thank you, Isabel. So the resource planning process has really long-term impacts and a ripple effect throughout how a utility just does business in general. Resource planning can and should include a robust analysis of the equity implications of many of the elements of each plan, whether it's building a new gas plant, extending the life of a coal plant, investing in energy efficiency, and everything in between. It has a direct impact on customers and the community. Barbara, can you discuss a little bit about how we can hold utilities accountable to the findings at places like the Public Utilities Commission?
Thanks, Joe. Well, certainly, I think one of the main ways to do it is through reports like this, and to try to get them before the Public Utilities Commission to really get them to focus on some of these issues. When a commission is considering a utility plan, a long-term utility plan, they're looking at lots of estimates and data, very long-term stuff about energy needs and energy costs. And then they also hear a lot from groups of people who, for example, want to see a plant built because they want the construction jobs, or they don't want to see a coal plant close because they want to keep those jobs, or they want, as a community, to maintain that tax income. And these are very human stories to tell, and they're very compelling, I think, to the commission, and rightly so, because these are human impacts that are part of what the commission needs to consider in making these long-term decisions. But, and this is the point I think Brett was making as well, so are the health impacts, and they're always going to be somewhat underestimated or undervalued, I think, because we don't know who's going to suffer from those health impacts. We can talk about, what groups are most likely to feel them, but you're not going to have an individual there saying, this might kill me, usually you won't have that. And to have some greater recognition for the commission so they understand these human impacts, and to the extent that the public can weigh in to say, yeah, this matters to us. We really care about our health, and we want to see these risks reduced. That can only, I think, be very helpful in helping us to, in fact, actually reduce those risks.
Thank you, Barbara. And James, given your broader Midwest view, how are other states doing this?
Yeah, well, with respect to making sure utilities are accountable for looking at this kind of information, and going back to the Michigan example I discussed earlier, we're also now able to use Kelsey and PSE's approach in a workshop and rulemaking process to revise the state's IRP filing requirements and planning parameters. So these are the rules that govern how utilities prepare their resource plans and what types of information they have to include when they file them. So what started out as company-specific testimony, we're hoping will now be incorporated into statewide resource planning requirements. So for Minnesota, we could similarly think about, how does this Minnesota Power analysis serve as a foundation for either commission updates to IRP rules or a legislative provision to ensure that all utilities are accountable to analyze the public health and environmental justice effects of their decisions. And speaking of legislation, the data and information here is certainly applicable beyond just resource planning dockets. Greater awareness and understanding of health impacts of the inequitable exposure to pollution can inform electric sector decarbonization requirements. For example, in Illinois, we don't have integrated resource planning, but the legislature enacted a targeted phase out of fossil fuel plants that prioritizes protection of environmental justice communities. So the work that PSE has done here could be similarly used in Minnesota.
Absolutely. Thank you, James. And gosh, I was so ambitious with the roundtable discussion and our timing. So we have one final roundtable question, and then we're going to do the Q&A, and maybe we'll go a little long there. But this closing, I don't want to call it a lightning round, but a closing quick question for Jenna and Isabel. So what should advocates do with this information? And I do want to note before we answer this question, in the post-event email I'm going to send to everyone who registered, I'll have links to resources and action alerts and things like that. So we're going to talk about a bunch of stuff now, but stay tuned for resources. So Jenna, why don't you tackle this question first?
Yeah, thanks, Joe. Yes, the public information landscape about this IRP is really dominated by big interests. And, Minnesota Power is an investor-owned utility, so their bottom line is to make their shareholders money and not to provide an essential service. And again, the PUC is supposed to make decisions that align with the public interest. So no decision about us without us is for us. Right. So I do want to encourage everyone to submit a public comment to the PUC prior to that reply comment deadline, June 30th. Thank you, Joe, for sending out information and supporting folks in doing that. And we want to be supporting folks, especially to be telling the PUC to take public health seriously in their approach to this IRP. So sign those petitions, sign the action alerts with an organization like Sierra Club or Fresh Energy. We make it easier for you. Tell the people in your life, family, friends, book clubs, faith communities, invite them to send in a comment. You can post it on social media, write a letter to the editor, just help spread public awareness. So just like we support folks in practicing democracy by showing up to city council meetings or calling legislators. We want folks to feel empowered to show up in regulatory spaces and make known that their decisions affect our lives and our communities.
Thanks, Jenna. Very inspiring. It's like you're an organizer or something. Izzy, do you want to add anything there?
Well, I don't really want to go after Jenna, but thank you, Joe. No, I don't have much to add. You know, if you'd like to submit a comment to the Public Utilities Commission for the next deadline, click the link that will be in the follow-up email. For other advocates that are interested in using this information, you know, check out the report, reach out to us if you have questions. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to be working with PSE again on the Otter Tail Resource Plan, and there are potentially other opportunities for us to continue expanding on the research or using it in new ways, applying it to different proceedings or questions. So feel free to reach out to us with those things, and we're happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you. And as I mentioned, there'll be a bunch of links in the post-event email, I promise. I know UCS has an action alert too. So we have five actual minutes for Q&A, and I know some of our panelists can stay after, so maybe we'll go a little long, but anyone who needs to leave at noon, no hard feelings, you're welcome to, panelists and attendees. So thanks everyone for being with us, but I'm going to dig into questions right off the bat. So first I want to address Tess's question. It was sent in when they registered. So I think this might be for Isabel or Barbara. The two of you can maybe take this. What differences are there between the process of the IRPs for Minnesota Power versus Excel, either in policy or in practice? I mean, it's each IRP, the process is like similar, but utilities are so different. Like, do we have learnings from Excel that can come into play here or vice versa?
Should I jump in there, Isabel?
That'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, formally, the processes are supposed to be really the same. They're supposed to submit their plan, and then there's a round of initial comments by everybody, and then there's a round of reply comments, and then there's a hearing and a decision. With Excel, and by the way, the Excel one is now over, things got dragged out a lot longer because they changed their plan. They changed their modeling approach, and then they changed their plan, and they made changes in the right direction. So we were really happy about that. But that process took a very long time. I think there are some things that came out of that we are hoping become examples in the Minnesota Power IRP, which is going on. We've filed initial comments, and then there are reply due, I think it's June 29th, or Jen actually, well, it's at the end of June. So what we're hoping comes out of Excel, for example, is the precedent and the lesson that this is really no time to be building big new gas plants. And so we hope that can help influence the commission to recognize the argument we've been making that they should not be building in Minnesota Power, should not be building NTEC. Also, there were some really interesting new equity provisions that were put into the order, in the Excel order, and maybe Isabel, you can go into that more, but we're hoping that some of those will also be duplicated in the order for Minnesota Power, and we've asked for that in our comments.
Yeah, just briefly, since we're low on time, yeah, the commission approved, I would say, some, I don't know if groundbreaking is the right word, but we made really good progress toward incorporating more equity considerations and process in resource plans in that commission decision. And essentially, it will revolve around a new docket and a stakeholder process that Excel will convene to look at specific equity issues in the interim between now and their next IRP. And we are hoping that this will be replicated for the other two IOUs as well.
Thank you, Isabel and Barbara. So Megan directed me over to a question or comment in the chat from Cecilia that I want to get to. So Cecilia says, I understand the PUC will have a public written comment period in Minnesota on Minnesota Power's IRP until June 30th. Will the PUC also hold public hearings related to the IRP? And if so, are the organizations here that worked with BIPOC community members to collect the data for this report also working with BIPOC community members to testify and share their voices? And I know, Jenna, you kind of chatted back, but I wanted to make sure we discussed this so everyone can hear. So Jenna, do you want to jump in here right off the bat?
Yeah, thank you so much. And Cecilia, thank you so much for this question. I think that this is the process doesn't end here with a report and a presentation. We want to make sure that the communities that we have been in conversation with this last year in putting together this report have the data that they need, have the language that they need to speak about it. And we want to be providing support to organizations and community leaders who are interested in submitting a written comment to the PUC. We want to adequately support those groups. And yeah, thank you for asking.
Thanks, Jenna. And I've got another question pre-submitted from Stephanie. So Stephanie says, and I think James, you might be the first to tackle this one. How will it become standard practice that these types of studies are done for all proposed power projects? And maybe Kelsey, you could weigh in here too. And I know there's like not a one size fits all, like it's a process, but James, seeing like the Midwest view, what is your thought on this?
Well, you know, as we've talked about, just having an analysis like this going into the record and being part of the discussion is the first step. And then as the compelling nature of the data, the scientific backing of it gains more recognition, we can then have commissions citing it and considering it in their decisions, and then requiring utilities to include it in to do the analysis themselves in their next plan. And then the further step from there is, you know, as commissions are making this type of analysis part of their decision making, we can look to incorporate that into the rules that govern resource planning, and make it a standard legal requirement, so that all of us can have this data to look at, to comment on, to critique going forward. Kelsey, what do you think?
Thanks.
I think what you said was right on point. Yeah, I'll just add that I think sort of coming up with, you know, this precedent that then we can move on, that then we can sort of establish a precedent and establish certain metrics that we look at consistently across these types of planning processes would be very useful in terms of just like being able to compare between different plans as well.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you both. So I have a question from Linda, and I think, Barbara, this one might be for you. So given that Minnesota Power has sold off 60% of its share in Intech to out-of-state utilities, what influence will the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission decision on Intech have for other regulatory agencies in the other states, like Wisconsin? So in other words, can Intech still be built in spite of the Minnesota Public Utilities Commission potentially ruling against it?
Well, I guess the honest answer is we're not sure. It's possible it could go forward even if Minnesota regulators told Minnesota Power not to do this. But one thing to keep in mind is that Minnesota Power, while it right now is expected to only own 20% of the plant, or rather its affiliate would only own 20% of the plant and only take 20% of its energy, Minnesota Power is the entity that is going to be building it and running it. So if the Minnesota Utility Commission tells them, no, they should not do that, and they should not be using in any way Minnesota Power's ratepayers' money to support this project, it might cancel, or maybe they would find somebody else to build it, or maybe it wouldn't be built there. But basically our goal at this point is to do what we can with the issues before us.
Could I add to
Please.
that?
Yes, please, Brett.
Yeah, Barbara did a great job of explaining. But I also want to say one of the reasons, you know, Minnesota Power would go through this public process to get this done rather than have this built privately is so that Minnesota Power ratepayers pay for it, right? So it's very, if it's so, if it's such a no-brainer to build this plant, why don't you build it privately? And the reason is it's very much at a risk being a stranded asset. So you don't see a ton of private equity going into gas plants nationwide. It's just really risky. So yeah, I hope the PUC would take that into consideration.
And Brett, I've got another question for you. So I know this report has only been out for a short amount of time, but in your work in the area up in northern Minnesota, in the Duluth area, have you seen any changes in public sentiment or like a deepening of, you know, what people are standing up for on this issue?
Barbara mentioned that the XL IRP was a really long process, and that meant this has been a really long process. So Minnesota Power came out with their plan, their initial IRP plan last February. Usually we had hearings then in the spring on that, and then it's been delayed until now. So I don't think it gets a lot of play up here, quite frankly. And so I think that this type of report is just critical to get out there to show people, A, that this is happening, that B, they can participate and see their real world impacts to you and your community, you know, that are related. So I don't think it's out there enough, and we're going to try to get that out there, but we need everyone's help to do that. So
Here. Thank you, Brett. So I see a bunch of questions in the Q&A that are, I think, not the focus of this specific webinar, but I just want to like speak to them. So questions about what are our alternatives to burning fossil gas and coal? How do we transition to clean power? Like some of those kind of nuts and bolts things. And I think folks who are wondering about that would be like, it would be helpful if they read the blog posts that we put together, like kind of going through the comments that were filed by the clean energy organizations. And those comments aren't just the health report comments, they're like the analysis on energy mix and things like that. So Isabel, could you talk a little bit about just the thought that went into the comments kind of outside of the health report elements?
Sure, and Barb probably can better answer this than I can, but there is I did see those questions as well, and I answered one of them, but just to answer it verbally, the comments that our organizations put together include a fairly detailed alternative resource plan that has greater renewable energy investment at equivalent or lower cost to Minnesota Power's plan. And we use the same modeling tools that they use. And we also did a reliability analysis, and our plan is equivalently reliable. So it doesn't have any of those potential reliability concerns. So definitely encourage you all to read the blog to hear more about the details of that, and the retirement dates and specific megawatt amounts that we are recommending Minnesota Power procure. Barb, did you want to add anything there?
I think just one thing that I'll add that is important to keep in mind when we try to visualize a future reliable energy system is a subject we haven't touched on at all today, and that's energy storage. And in the modeling we put forward, we include energy storage, that is batteries mainly. Battery technology is getting much better. We're able to store more energy and do it for longer, and that's expected to increase. And so the further we look out into the future, the more we expect we'll have to rely on batteries in addition to the renewables. But obviously, that is a huge question. How do we do it? And we've put a lot of resources into trying to show exactly how that can be done, certainly for the next few years, with an anticipation of these other technologies getting even better than they are now.
And I'll make sure that a link for the comments and the blog posts outside of even the health report end up in that post-event email. So I think our listeners will have hours and hours of reading if they want, related to the IRP and all those other elements. So now we are 9 minutes over time. Are there any burning thoughts that our panelists need to get out there, like lightning round, super quick? I know we've talked about a lot today, but any last words? Oh my gosh, we did it all. It only took us 10 extra minutes. So thank you everyone for being with us today. Really appreciate it. A recording, both on YouTube and just audio of this webinar will be emailed to you probably yet today or early tomorrow. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.